The assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is another sign that political violence is growing around the world, experts say, as extremist attitudes became further normalized. The isolation and economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has driven more people online and into spaces where they have become radicalized, those experts add. The growing threat will require attention and action from government, who must confront the issue of domestic terrorism and extremism, they said. "I'm very worried," said Ruth Marshall, a political scientist and religious studies professor at the University of Toronto. "Those of us who study extremism and political violence, and as a small group, are growing very concerned that this is on the rise." Police in Japan say that Tetsuya Yamagami, the 41-year-old man accused of murdering Abe during a campaign speech with a homemade gun on Friday, told investigators he had plotted to kill him because he believed rumors about the former leader's connection to a certain organization that police did not identify. According to the police account, Yamagami's mother has been bankrupted by donations to the organization, which was later identified as a French religious group known as the Unification Church. Tomihiro Tanaka, head of the Church Japan branch, later confirmed the mother was a member, but distanced the group from the shooting, which he called perplexing and causing deep outrage. The church, often described as a financially motivated cult, whose followers are referred to as Moonies, after his South Korean founder Sun Yun-moon, has hosted speeches by Abe and other conservative world leaders, including Donald Trump, a member of his administration. Moon's son, Shan Moon, has since created his own church in Pennsylvania, known as the Road of Iron Ministers, that has ties to far-right figures like Steve Bannon and has spread conspiracy theories about impeding a civil war in the United States. But all of that doesn't fully explain why Yamagami allegedly felt compelled to shoot and kill Abe, said Jonathan Miller, a director at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, who studies the Indo-Pacific region. He says a large number of men of Yamagami's generation, impacted by Japan's economic downturn in the early 1990s, are living at home and sometimes dealing with mental health issues and are increasingly turning to online sanctuaries. The online space in Japan, it does have some fringe and some dark part on the web that have been taken advantage of by some to recruit and radicalize, he said. If this was someone who was in a poor economic situation, he was disaffected and angry. He may have been inspired somewhere down the line to take matters into his own hands, but we don't know enough about how that happened or why. Japan is no stranger to conspiracy theories or political violence. A cult group known as the Aum Shinrikyo deployed sarin gas on the Tokyo subway in 1995, killing 14 people. There have been reports of the QAnon conspiracy gaining a foothold in the country, although some have disputed its impact. Yet, much like in the West, politicians in Japan have seized upon political dissatisfaction for their own gains. After Abe's assassination, social media users pointed to comments made by Akihiko Kurokawa, Secretary General of the populist NHK Party, who say Abe was responsible for founding groups like the Unification Church as the front of the foreign spy activities. Spies condemning the shooting, NHK Party leader Takashi Tachibana took time to suggest Abe's death was inspired in part by economic turmoil created by the policies of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, of which Abe was a member, that have put people in a desperate situation. Miller said this type of political divisiveness has been seen around the world, and is contributing to the rise in extremist behavior. Different divisions in politics are no longer disagree but not disagreeable, but rather disagree and be disagreeable and be divisive, he said, and some of those divisions are leading into a significant level of extremism. Republican politicians in the U.S., like Donald Trump and his allies, have appointed Democrats as election frauds and evil people intent on destroying the country. The committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attacks on the U.S. Capitol has presented evidence showing that rhetoric helped fuel the riots. On Tuesday, the committee demonstrated how far-right groups like Proud Boys and Oath Keepers have direct lines to the Trump White House and Republican lawmaker and were inspired by their attacks on the election to plan for violence at the Capitol. In Canada, far-right figureheads were openly wishing the so-called Freedom Convoy blockade that shut down Ottawa for 3 weeks early this year will be our January 6 moment that will bring down the government, even calling for people to be hanged. Conservative MPs, including leadership frontrunner Pierre Poilievre, have shown support for the Freedom Convoy movement, whose organizers have documented ties to extremism and racism. Poilievre and other MPs have insisted they only support peaceful protests against COVID-19 vaccine mandate and reject any racist or violent beliefs. But experts have told the media that politicians risk legitimizing such fringe extremist groups but causing up to them. Politicians have a more mainstream audience than the extreme fringe does, even Folward, executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, said in an earlier interview. So when politicians endorse march with them, it is now introducing those ideas, those concepts, those movements, those ideologies to a wider audience. Marshall said there are very, very few countries in the world that are immune from such a rise in extremism, particularly far-right populism or fascism, which can quickly soar into authoritarian strongman politics. She said the COVID-19 pandemic has further driven people deeper into their social media algorithm, where misinformation and conspiracy theories proliferate. Violence often becomes the solution if you are in this paranoid mode of thinking, she said. Political dissatisfaction is growing in other countries too. A recent report and survey by the United Kingdom-based group Hope Not Hate suggests over half of the population is not satisfied with the way democracy is working in the UK. A German government report found instances of politically motivated violent crime had grown by 10% last year compared to the year before. In Brazil, a local opposition official was shot dead last weekend during the run-up to national elections. Miller said governments need to look inward and have honest conversations about domestic extremism and politically motivated violence, including how those attitudes are shaped by the internet. Although Canada, the US, and other Western nations have tried to sound the alarm, both the FBI and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service have identified domestic extremism as their top priority. Miller said Japan may be slow to address the problem. There is still a sense in Japan that even though they admit they are not a perfect country, we don't have the same problems as these other countries, he said. It's not a lack of willingness to have the conversation, but more whether they all give it the priority it deserves. But this is something not only Japan, but also the entire G7 needs to focus on, because it's not going away. Listen to this and other podcasts on Omar Global Radio, omarglobal.com. From Quebec, Canada, Omar Diaz reported.